Welcome to Cabeza de Vaca. Episode 21, The Arrowhead. I'm Brandon Seale. At least twice in his account, Cabeza de Vaca states that his companion, Alonso Castillo, had been the first in his party to start faith healing. Cabeza de Vaca himself seems to have been the second to take to the role, but he adds that, quote, I was the boldest and most daring when it came to performing cures, end quote. We saw this clearly back in episode 16 when he brought a dead man back to life, at a moment when he probably didn't need to risk his fragile reputation as a new medicine man on such a risky proposition. We've also seen some circumstantial but convincing evidence back in episode 14 that it may have been Esteban who had first convinced the natives that the four strange-looking expeditionaries weren't just beggars, but were in fact powerful medicine men. And in the previous episode, it was Dorantes to whom the natives brought a precious copper rattle, and later on he'll be given 5 emerald arrowheads, suggesting something of his prowess as a healer as well. All of which is to say that by the late summer of 1535, the 4 former Narvaez expeditionaries were 3 months into their rebooted traveling medicine show, and they were damn good at what they did. Quote, we never cured anyone who didn't later say that he was healthy, end quote, Cabeza de Vaca claims, though he later qualifies this a bit, saying, quote, even those who weren't cured believed that we had the power to cure them, end quote. Which suggests to me that in addition to physical cures, the expeditionaries were also offering their patients something else. Hope, or faith, or love, or something for which there was apparently a market in 16th century North America. As evidence for their success, the 4 medicine men were now being followed by thousands of Native Americans, representing, quote, so many places and diverse languages that my memory can't even remember them all, end quote. All of them wanting to be close to the mysterious medicine men and to be a part of whatever this movement was that they were now leading into modern-day northern Coahuila. But leading a movement was exhausting. The expeditionaries' thousands of followers, quote, wouldn't dare eat any food, even if they were dying of hunger, unless we blessed it first, end quote. And by any food, they meant like every single bite, like a priest blessing each communion wafer. Quote, it was so much work to have to blow and bless each follower's food and drink, and for many other things they wanted to do, they came to us first to ask permission. So you can imagine how much we were inconvenienced by all these requests, end quote. And yet, to call the Native Americans who were in their entourage followers may be misleading, because the 4 medicine men admitted that they had little control over them. In each new village they entered, in fact, their entourage ran wild. They took everything they could from the people living there, distributed the goods amongst themselves, then consoled/recruited their victims by telling them that they could be made whole if they just joined in on the movement themselves. Yet as much as the 4 expeditionaries may have lamented this quote-unquote ritual marauding, to use Rolena Adorno and Charles Pautz's term, they knew that they benefited from it. It gave their movement a Ponzi scheme momentum of its own, as each village they robbed brought them new recruits from the villagers who lived there who wanted to be made whole by robbing the next village. The whole thing was more than a little bit uncomfortable for the 4 expeditionaries. It led them to really question the forces that they had unleashed and to question the source of their healing powers. Think back to episode 17, where Cabeza de Vaca tells us about Mala Cosa, a shadowy trickster figure that showed up in the local lore around the same time that Europeans did. And sure enough, the more Cabeza de Vaca described Mala Cosa, the more that Mala Cosa started to sound like him. I've interpreted this as an expression of the self-doubt that Cabeza de Vaca and his companions had about their own cures. Maybe they had as much trouble believing in them as most modern readers of Cabeza de Vaca's account do as well. And so uncomfortable, in fact, did it make them that they gave up healing entirely in early 1535, just a few months after they had first started. They laid down their ceremonial gourds and tried to earn an honest living, and they failed miserably. Whereas as medicine men, they were esteemed guests wherever they went, cared for and carried through the land. Once they stopped healing, they were just useless mouths to feed. And so in the early summer of 1535, they consented to start healing again, all while contending with the primal, uncontrollable side of humanity that had exposed them to. And to be fair, it's not as if they didn't try to assert their authority over their movement at different times. 2 episodes ago, when they were just a couple hundred miles from the northernmost settlement of New Spain on the Rio Pánuco, they inexplicably turned around 180 degrees in the opposite direction. More than anything, it seems that what they wanted to do was to try to lose the followers who had attached themselves to them. And the 4 expeditionaries thought that their gambit had worked. But then, about 48 hours later, their old entourage came back with a vengeance, sacking and pillaging their new hosts with only the slightest veneer of religious ritual on top of it. And somewhere around here as well, we start to get mention in Cabeza de Vaca's account of certain native headmen, quote-unquote principales, amongst their band of followers, who seem to have been the ones really calling the shots. The headmen soon placed a posse outside of each of the expeditionaries' lodges each night, ostensibly to protect them, but perhaps also to make sure they didn't sneak away again. Indeed, Professor Andrés Reséndez describes the expeditionaries' journey from this point forward as an ongoing quote-unquote negotiation with these native headmen, who still needed the medicine men's magic to accomplish whatever their goals were, just as much as the expeditionaries needed the headmen to keep moving northwest across the continent. But the copper rattle that the natives had gifted to Andrés Durantes in the last village had stirred something in the 4 old conquistadors. Maybe it had reminded them of the gold rattle they had found back in Florida. Maybe it had reminded them why they came to the New World in the first place. At the very least, it validated their intuition that to the northwest there might be a larger, sedentary, agricultural society, the kind of society that Castilians knew much better how to work with. Whatever it was, something at this juncture made the already bold Cabeza de Vaca even bolder. Quote, "Here they brought me a man, and they told me that he had been wounded a long time ago by an arrow entering his back from the right, and that he had the arrowhead right up against his heart. He said that it caused him quite a bit of pain, and that because of it, he was always sick." End quote. This is an interesting case because it's the first one we've heard of with a clear physical cause. Cabeza de Vaca can't just wave his hands and make the sign of the cross and pretend like he's done with this guy. If, that is, he chooses to accept the challenge to cure. Which to me sounds potentially even riskier than trying to heal a dead man. I mean, at the end of the day, no one actually expects you to be able to raise a dead man back to life. So if it fails, well, there's some damage control you can do there. But here, Cabeza de Vaca is being asked to conduct open-heart surgery. And he agrees to it. Here's how it went down. Quote, "I cut open his chest with a knife to where the arrowhead was," end quote, and stop there for a second to imagine cutting into someone's chest with a flint knife while he's lying awake in front of you. Continuing, quote, "I saw that the arrowhead had gone in crooked, which made it very hard to remove. I twisted my knife and inserted it further, and with a lot of work, I was able to get it out. It was very large. With a deer bone needle, I gave him 2 stitches. And 2 days later, I cut out the stitches, and the Indian was as good as new. He told me that he didn't feel any pain whatsoever," end quote. So this time I'll skip over my usual oohing and awing, because this is on its face an impressive feat and one of the most widely recognized stories in Cabeza de Vaca's account. But I just have to say that I find this entire cure indefensibly reckless. What would have happened to Cabeza de Vaca if his patient had bled out on the operating floor in front of him? He had nothing to gain. He was already the most famous and powerful medicine man in his part of the world, and he and his companions had everything to lose. It's hard to see why Cabeza de Vaca went ahead with this. I can't help but wonder if there's a component of ego at play here. Because interestingly, Cabeza de Vaca doesn't credit or even mention God following this cure, which is a bit unusual. I mean, he just conducted open-heart surgery in the Coahuila brush country and managed to save a man's life. If anything is worth thanking God for, it would be something like this. Instead, he mentions only his own reputation. Quote, "This cure gave us among the Indians as much reputation throughout all that land as they were capable of esteeming and holding dear, end quote. This really is a different response than the one we've grown accustomed to from Cabeza de Vaca. And the material rewards that start to accrue at this point are of a different nature altogether as well. It's no longer just baskets of roast prickly pears. Now it's real mineral wealth, marcasite, antimony, beads, and spectacular furry brown leather robes. And the extraction of the arrowhead in Cabeza de Vaca's account also coincides with a renewed obsession with finding corn. In fact, the 4 expeditionaries here start to sound a bit like they had 7 years earlier back in Florida. And increasingly, Cabeza de Vaca, Castillo, Dorantes, and Esteban are beginning to see their daily interactions with their followers in terms of a struggle for quote-unquote authority, an expression perhaps of their uncomfortable tug of war with the native headmen that they had to deal with daily, but it's also a far cry from the spirit of service that had really sustained them through the hardest times so far on this continent. And in fact, by this point in the narrative, it has been almost 7 chapters since Cabeza de Vaca has even mentioned God, a glaring omission for a man so grounded in his faith through the preceding 23 chapters. By the fall of 1535, the expeditionaries' multi-thousand-person band had descended from the Sierra Madre Oriental, and the 4 expeditionaries once again came upon a large river, its waters running chest-deep. It was, according to the route that we're following, the Rio Grande once again, maybe in the region of modern-day Boquillas, Coahuila. This would place them just opposite of Big Bend National Park, which may be the easiest place that listeners could get to appreciate the terrain that these expeditionaries were traveling through. That anything can live in this landscape is a miracle, and indeed, Cabeza de Vaca records that they traveled almost 150 miles at one point without seeing any game. Pretty soon, the deer hunters and the rabbit hunters were coming home empty-handed, as well as even the grub hunters scrounging for grasshoppers and worms, and even the foragers probably weren't collecting enough for everyone. Also, in continuing to travel northwest, the party was entering territory occupied by historic enemies of some of those in the entourage. And so the entourage began to push back against their 4 medicine men. One day, the power struggle came to a head. One of the native headmen told the expeditionaries that he and his people wouldn't go any further. Now, the expeditionaries clearly needed their followers to protect, guide, and forage for them. But there was also no way that they were going to go back the way they had come from. And so the expeditionaries dug their heels in. Quote, "To them we said that we wanted to go where the sun sets," end quote. No, their followers replied. "Es que there's no people there, no food, no water, as you can see for yourself." The expeditionaries called them on this. "You've told us that before," they said, "and you were wrong. Send out some scouts and see what they find." "This is the land of our enemies. We can't send scouts out here," they objected. "Well, but then send out women," the expeditionaries insisted. "Women can travel with safety." The native headmen finally agreed, but they also seemed to have given their women scouts instructions to make sure that they didn't find anything. And sure enough, when they returned 5 days later to report that the landscape ahead was a total empty, barren desert, the expeditionaries blew up. Cabeza de Vaca stormed out of camp and into the monte. His companions, Castillo, Dorantes, and Esteban, seemed to have done the same. Their entourage of natives kept waiting for them to return, but soon night came and went, and the next morning found the 4 expeditionaries still refusing to have any contact with anyone. This terrified the natives. These 4 men were the most powerful medicine men on the continent, and they seemed to be pissed off at them. Quote, "They came to where I was, and all night they were not sleeping and very afraid, speaking to me, telling me how scared they were, begging us not to be mad, and even if they knew they were to die along the way with us, they now said they would go where we wanted them to go," end quote. But all this seems to have just annoyed the expeditionaries even more. Another day passed, and Cabeza de Vaca and his 3 companions still refused to rejoin their followers. Quote, "And then a strange thing happened," end quote. Back in camp, 300 of the natives fell ill. And then, soon thereafter, 8 of them died. For a party of thousands like this one was, a stationary camp is a pretty deeply unsanitary and frankly deadly thing. But to the natives, what it looked like was that when the 4 expeditionaries had withdrawn from their community, they had withdrawn their protection as well. Which, by the way, is what the natives had always said would happen. They had always believed that so long as the expeditionaries were with them, no harm could befall them. This is why, from their perspective, they weren't just following the 4 medicine men. They couldn't let them out of their sight, or else, well, look around you. You see what's happening now. At first, the expeditionaries did nothing to dispel this notion. From his isolation outside the main camp, quote, Andrés Dorantes told one of his Indians to tell the others that because they wished to compel them to take them, they were all dying, end quote. Basically saying that because you won't let us go where we want to go, your people are dying. It all sent a shockwave of terror rippling through their band of thousands. Quote, throughout all the land where this became known, they had so much fear of us that it seemed simply by looking at us, they would die, end quote. Their followers start to go crazy. They tell everyone to back off and just leave the 4 medicine men alone. They would scold crying children to keep them quiet, and actually at one point punished a mourning woman whose cries were too loud by scraping her from head to toe with rat's teeth. For 15 days, Cabeza de Vaca says, the expeditionaries, quote, never saw one of the Indians laugh nor cry, nor otherwise show his feelings, end quote. It's a bit of a puzzle to me why the expeditionaries let this go on for as long as they did. But if I'm being charitable, I have to recall that for the last 7 years, these 4 men had been at the mercy of this, quote, strange and evil land, end quote. And now, for the first time really, they found themselves in a position of power. And yet when they acted on that power, they found that it produced some awful consequences. Not only could they cause great emotional distress to people who really cared deeply for them, they could kill them just by ignoring them, just by removing from their company. And yet, by pulling out of their community, the expeditionaries knew that they had committed a sin. As Professor Gilbert Hinojosa at the University of Incarnate Word pointed out to me, Cabeza de Vaca, at least, seems to hold to some idea that faith exists in a communal setting. That without community, there is only vulnerability. And vulnerability without faith is a diminished and terrible existence. And this was an idea, incidentally, that the natives amongst whom he was living probably could relate to. In fact, I think we could argue that the Malacosa story represents the manifestation of this idea in counterpoint. Malacosa was a demonic, solitary figure on the fringes of society, coming and going as he pleased, taking whatever he wanted, leaving behind only scars and nightmares, with no attachments to a community, with no sense of service to keep him grounded, and hence with no divine protection to offer alongside his magic. And at this moment, when the 4 expeditionaries have pulled out of their community, they look more like Malacosa than at any other point in this story. And they knew it. Quote, the truth is that seeing all this suffering caused us more pain than we could bear, end quote. And at a practical level, it scared them. Quote, we feared that those who didn't die would leave us alone out of fear, and that all other peoples ahead of us would avoid us, seeing what had happened to our followers, end quote. They suddenly realized that they weren't in the position of supreme power that they thought they were in. That they were, in fact, extremely vulnerable, as naked as they had ever been. But now that they recognized this, and they were focused again on their vulnerability, they at least knew what they needed to do next. On the next episode of Cabeza de Vaca. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to check out the webpage associated with this episode on therivardreport.com, home of nonprofit journalism for a better San Antonio. Editing for this episode was performed by Susana Canseco, sound engineering by Stephen Bennett. The music for this series is entitled Apache. It was composed by Kevin Graham and is available on Soundstripe. A special thanks to Father David Garcia, to Dr. Frank de la Teja with the Texas State Historical Association, to Steve Davis, curator of the Whitliff Collections at Texas State University, to Professor Andrés Resendez at the University of California, Davis, to Dr. Carolyn Boyd with the Shumla Archaeological Research and Education Center and also Texas State, and to David Dunham with Texas Monthly for all their support and suggestions. You'll hear more about them throughout the season. And for more information about us and our other projects, you can check out our website at www.brandonseale.com.